Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your lunch or lunches and have found the opportunity for some stimulating conversations. Some of the best opportunities we find at these Wroclaw Global Forum are the relationships that you make, the people you get to know, the hallway conversations that end up lasting relationships, particularly on a beautiful day today where you can go out on the terrace. I won't spend long with introductions, but I have a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. First, for those of you who do not speak English, there's an English-Polish translation available via the headsets. One of our speakers will be speaking in Polish, so for the English speakers, do have your headsets available. And the translation is on number 7. It's somewhat mysterious to me why number 7, since we're not dealing with 7 languages, but nevertheless, it is number. It's a lucky number. There we go. The panel's also on the record, and we invite you to engage with the panel in conversation by using the hashtag WGF16. We're here to discuss the security challenges facing NATO and Europe during this volatile period. We also have been doing Twitter polls. For those of you who want to go to @WGF on Twitter, you'll find the question. It's already up there. I'm going to say it right now, but you can also give your answer, and we'll give you the results at some point as well. At what point are we going to give the results of the Twitter poll? Soon. Anyway, they will tell us as we go along. So the question is, which topic most urgently needs to be discussed at the Warsaw NATO Summit, or hashtag Warsaw, hashtag NATO Summit? Number 1, the future of enlargement, so you have 4 choices. Number 2, the Russian threat. Number 3, threats in and from the Middle East. Number 4, defense spending and capabilities. So enlargement, Russia, Mideast, defense spending and capabilities. When NATO heads of state convene in a little bit more than a month, and we'll be convening our own young leaders group there of the Atlantic Council, 65 of the top young leaders from the Alliance and partners from the Alliance and friends, they will confront one of the most serious sets of challenges since NATO's birth in 1949: how to respond to an aggressive and unpredictable Russia, the proliferation of security threats across the Middle East and their impact more broadly, and that includes, of course, the ongoing civil war in Syria and the rise of jihadism. Questions over NATO enlargement as Montenegro moves through the accession process, and fundamental considerations which have been a strain throughout the Wroclaw Global Forum of NATO's role and identity as a security provider in Europe. I think all of us in the room are familiar with recent trends that have come before the summit, and I think more than many summits in the past few years, this presents a critical opportunity for world leaders to convene and shape the future of the alliance, or not shape it, and bear the disadvantages of that. If NATO doesn't adapt rapidly and effectively to meet these new serious challenges, it risks a minimum its credibility, at worst its irrelevance. We at the Atlantic Council believe we're facing a time as important as the end of World War I, end of World War II, end of the Cold War. We're convinced that if we work more effectively together with our friends and allies around the world, this could be one of the most prosperous and secure periods of human history with technological advance. And if we don't, less benevolent actors or chaos may fill the void. We'll delve into these issues in this panel. I'm going to start the conversation by first turning to our panelists for their thoughts, posing 1 or 2 questions for them. We'll then move into a discussion and end with time for questions from the audience. I'd also ask the panelists to listen to the responses of the other panelists, because when I come to you, you may want to start by responding to something you've already heard. Let me go through introductions first. First, I'd like to introduce Senator Joe Manchin, who has represented his home state of West Virginia since 2010. He has stepped in. He's not on your program. We thank you, Senator, for stepping in. Commissioner Barnier, the advisor to President Juncker at the EU, has had his house flooded by the floods that are taking place across Europe. He sent his apologies yesterday that because of this emergency, personal emergency, he couldn't join us. I'm sure we all understand that and wish him the best. Senator Manchin, I've never seen him flooded by anything and handles all natural disasters just fine. He serves as the ranking member and most senior Democrat on the Senate Armed Services Subcommittee on Air-Land, which has responsibility for all Army and Air Force programs. Senator Manchin previously was governor of West Virginia. Rose Gottemoeller, the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. I've been stealing her ideas for years. In her role as Undersecretary, she advises Secretary Kerry on issues of arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament, and is key to defining the United States security policy. She's a skilled negotiator and policymaker, having previously served as Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Arms Control Verification Compliance, where she was the chief U.S. negotiator for the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty with the Russian Federation, which went into effect in 2011. We'll talk some about the relationship with Russia and how deterrence looks now with her. It's my pleasure to introduce Brigadier General James Mingus, Deputy Commanding General of the 4th Infantry Division. During more than 33 years of service, General Mingus has commanded at every echelon from company to brigade, in addition to working in key staff positions in both the Army, Special Operations Forces, and joint units. He notably deployed in Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom 12 times from 2001 to 2012, so this man knows what this kind of conflict looks like from the inside and can talk about the challenges facing us now. We're also lucky to be joined by Paweł Solo, head of Poland's National Security Bureau. Paweł, it's great to have you with us. You have a long history of working on defense issues as a civil servant, including positions as the president of the Sobieski Institute, Undersecretary of State and Director of the Department of General Security of the Ministry of Interior and Administration, Chief of National Civil Defense and Advisor to the Mayor of Warsaw. And so just an incredible panel. Leading us off in our comments is going to be Ambassador Alexander Vershbow. Sandy is the current Deputy Secretary General of NATO. He previously served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. And in that position, he was responsible for coordinating U.S. security and defense policies relating to the nations and international organizations of Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. While serving in the U.S. government, he was ambassador to NATO, ambassador to Russia, ambassador to the Republic of Korea. South Korea. He also served as special assistant to the president and senior director of European Affairs and National Security Council, and State Department director for Soviet Union Affairs. In short, he is one of the most accomplished diplomats of our generation. So Ambassador Vershbow, Sandy, I wonder if you could comment first. He'll give a little bit longer of an opening comment to tee up the summit. I'd ask other discussants to hold their answers to questions to 2 to 3 minutes so we can get in a maximum number of questions and answers. But I wonder if you could, as Deputy Secretary General of NATO, you have unique insights on the challenges currently facing the summit. Where is it heading, and what's the importance of the Warsaw Summit? What do you hope to see achieved in July? And maybe, though you're a diplomat, with all of your seniority, you can be a little bit undiplomatic in telling us what would constitute success and what would be less than that.
Okay. Thanks very much, Fred. It's great to be here, and thanks for the invitation. I think it's fair to say that the Warsaw Summit is shaping up to be one of the most consequential in NATO's history because, as you said, we face one of the most challenging security environments in decades, certainly in my career. And I attended my first NATO meeting as a young Foreign Service officer in 1977, so I've been around. And of course, the challenges are no longer just from one direction. We have to step up and meet challenges coming from the East, revanchist Russia, that's thrown away the international rule book with its illegal annexation of Crimea, with the insurgency that it is actively promoting and arming and fueling in eastern Ukraine. And at the same time, we have to deal with the arc of crisis that spans the whole Middle East, North Africa region, failing states, the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq and Levant, and the symptoms that are now directly affecting the security of our own member states, the uncontrolled and illegal migration, as well as terrorism, both imported and homegrown. And of course, there's the other multinational, transnational threats that we've been dealing with for some time: cyber attacks, nuclear proliferation, ballistic missile proliferation. So NATO has to be a full spectrum alliance more than ever before. And we need to take what we like to call in our marketing strategy a 360-degree approach. But that's a serious issue because we have to be able to show our publics, whether they live in the eastern half of the alliance or whether they are more focused on the challenges from the south, have to show them all that NATO is delivering. And I think we will. Failure is not an option as we go into the Warsaw Summit. And we're not starting from scratch. The Wales Summit in 2014, the year when this kind of watershed moment occurred in our security environment, represented our strong immediate response. And we've delivered on the things that we decided at Wales, including increasing the readiness of our forces, deploying this famous spearhead force that can deploy anywhere, but particularly to reinforce the eastern allies in a matter of 2 to 3 days. We've also augmented Turkey's air defenses in light of the potential spillover of the conflict in Syria. We've set up small headquarters along the eastern flank. We've increased the number of our exercises. And even on defense spending, which is still a challenge, there's at least some improvement. Majority of countries last year increased defense spending in real terms. We still only have 5 that meet the 2% goal, but the trends are improving, but it's definitely not good enough. But if Wales was the immediate response, Warsaw will be the place where we make important decisions about long-term adaptation. And this is being addressed under 2 broad themes. The first is protecting our citizens and our countries by strengthening our defense and deterrence posture. And the second we call projecting stability by doing more to stabilize our neighborhood, by helping our partners, whether in the east or in the south, to build their own defense capacity, to better equip themselves to fight against the forces of terrorism and violent extremism, and to help promote regional solutions to regional challenges. Now, the main deliverable on the first category, strengthening our defense and deterrence, will be enhancing our forward presence along the eastern flank of the alliance. More troops, more infrastructure, more pre-positioned equipment. And this presence will involve the deployment of multinational, rotational, battalion-sized units. The details are still being worked, but several countries are already beginning to offer to serve as the framework nation for each of these rotational battalions. And this is seen as an essential complement to the work we did at Wales on strengthening our capacity to reinforce. Because of the Russians' ability to mobilize a lot of forces very quickly, as they've demonstrated through their SNAP exercises, as well as the dangers of hybrid warfare, we not only need to be able to reinforce, we need to have at least some forces already there that can make clear to any adversary, but particularly to President Putin, that any attempt to challenge our borders and our security would be met not just by local forces, but by forces from across the alliance, from both sides of the Atlantic. So enhanced foreign presence, especially in the Northeast, will be key. We'll also be strengthening the deterrent presence, air and maritime, as well as ground, in the southeastern part of the alliance, recognizing that the Black Sea region is actually where Russian aggression has taken place. Georgia 2008, the annexation of Crimea, and so we need to take appropriate steps all along our eastern flank. There'll be other things that we'll unveil or reaffirm at Warsaw, including our strategy for countering hybrid warfare. And this will have an extra dimension thanks to the strengthened cooperation we've achieved this year with the European Union. I'm sorry Michel Barnier is not here, because we hope to announce a combined strategy for preventing and countering hybrid warfare with the European Union, reflecting the fact that neither of us has all the tools to deal with this complex set of threats, whether it's disinformation, threats to energy infrastructure, as well as special forces in the high-end dimension. So having a kind of division of labor between NATO and the EU is, I think, going to be one of the important achievements of Warsaw. We'll reaffirm the defense investment pledge from Wales, but I'm sure there will be a lot of efforts to even speed up progress towards the 2% goal, and equally important, 20% goal, spending 20% of your defense budget on equipment and modernization and reducing overhead to make that possible. Now, let me stress that all of the things I've just outlined will be defensive, proportional, in line with our international commitments, including the NATO-Russia Founding Act. Even though Russia can certainly be accused of violating their end of that bargain, allies have judged that it's important to maintain the high ground. That is certainly the document we would like Russia to adhere to. But the deployments that we have in mind can be carried out within the scope of the NATO-Russia Founding Act. Now, our policy towards Russia, of course, isn't only about defense and deterrence, and I expect that Warsaw will reaffirm our commitment to dialogue with Russia, dialogue from a position of strength. And of course, when you have a tense and potentially unstable relationship, dialogue is all the more important to manage the relationship, to try to bring back more predictability and transparency, avoid incidents from getting out of control. That's why we convened a meeting of the NATO-Russia Council in April and are trying to convene another one before the Warsaw Summit. Not because we're going back to partnership. That's not going to happen as long as Russia is carrying out its aggression against Ukraine. But because we want to manage a competitive relationship and keep things from heating up too much. Now, on projecting stability, I'll finish in a minute. As I said before, we recognize the need to help our neighbors be more secure themselves, because ultimately our security depends on having a stable neighborhood. So we will step up our support for Ukraine. We'll have a meeting of the NATO-Ukraine Commission at the highest level, and we will likely unveil a new comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine, which will build on the extensive support we've already been giving them through the 4 trust funds and through our support for defense reform. We'll continue to support Georgia, where we have a substantial package of assistance measures agreed at Wales, which is to help them strengthen their defenses, but also prepare for eventual NATO membership, which is still on the horizon. And we are trying to help Moldova with a defense capacity building program as well. But I think where we hope to achieve a step change when it comes to projecting stability is with respect to our Middle East and North African neighbors. We do a lot, but it's still of relatively modest impact with countries like Tunisia, Morocco, Jordan, and some of the Gulf states. We hope by the time of the summit to be able to announce a much increased program of assistance to Iraq, where we're right now training just limited numbers of Iraqi officers at a facility in Jordan. We hope to go into Iraq and do a much more substantial defense capacity building program. We hope to do more with Jordan, with Tunisia. We may, if we get a clear signal from the new government of national accord in Libya, take on the task of building their security institutions. And we're going to step up our maritime activities in the Mediterranean, building on the successful mission we're now running in the Aegean as a contribution to controlling illegal migration. So having a strong southern strategy based on a lot of our partnership tools, which were pioneered here in Central and Eastern Europe, together with our strong initiatives on deterrence and defense, that will, I think, constitute a successful summit. There'll still be work to do in the years that follow. We'll have to see how the Russian military capabilities evolve. They are building up these bastions in Kaliningrad, in occupied Crimea, where they could carry out operations to impede NATO reinforcements and freedom of movement. We have to continue to sharpen our toolkit against hybrid warfare. But I think that you will be impressed when we get to Warsaw. This will be a very strong display of alliance unity and alliance commitment to concrete steps to strengthen the security of all 28 allies and our key partners and neighbors on our periphery. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Sandy. And I'm going to ask you a follow-up question that could have a huge and long answer, but I'll ask you to hold it short and then have Pavel maybe take this as his tee-up question for his first question. And that is, Poland has made clear that it considers permanent troop presence to be a priority for the summit. Can you, for the audience, decode a little bit the semantics in how we're talking about presence right now, and what is actually necessary in today's world to provide the deterrence that you think would be actually useful? And I know there are divisions within the alliance on these questions.
Well, actually, I think we're coming together in terms of supporting what we're calling a persistent rotational presence. And persistent means continuous, 365 days a year, but that the forces themselves may shift from one month to the next in terms of the sending states and the exact capabilities they have. Now, the Russians say that this is the same thing as permanent. That's their privilege to challenge our semantics. But actually having this on a rotational basis gives us the opportunity for more countries to contribute, promotes burden sharing within the alliance by enabling countries who may not be able to sustain multi-year commitments to at least rotate forces in for 3 months or 6 months. And I think that strengthens the signal that we're trying to send, that the whole alliance is committed to defending every ally, including the most exposed in the East. But in terms of our commitments under the NATO-Russia Founding Act, this is well below any reasonable definition of substantial combat forces, which is what we talked about in 1997. Battalion-sized units are well below any reasonable definition of substantial combat forces.
Thank you for that. Pavel, persistent rotational presence. Would that be success for you? Is that, and what needs to come out of the summit for the meeting to be considered a success from the Polish standpoint?
Przede wszystkim dziękuję za zaproszenie I dziękuję za
So first and foremost, thank you very much for
kolejną
inviting me
edycję
to the summit. Thank you
spotkania
for giving us the opportunity of meeting with you at Wrocław. Thank you to the organizers.
I również
Thank you to
prezydentowi miasta
the mayor
Wrocławia
of
I mam nadzieję,
Wrocław. We are hoping that
tak będzie I w następnych
it is
latach,
going to be
bo
the same situation in the coming years, because this is
Natomiast
already
odpowiadając
a meeting, a form of tradition. But responding directly to your question, firstly,
to nie jest tylko stanowisko polskie.
it's not just the Polish standpoint, it's not just this Polish expectation as far as these reinforced
I teraz kwestia nazewnictwa, no w każdym
extreme, well, and again we come to the terms of semantics, permanent rotating presence or sustained permanent sustained rotational presence. There is a huge feeling of anxiety connected to this aggressive policy of Russia towards Romania, towards Baltic states, the countries of the Visegrad Group. So it's just not the wish and intent and standpoint and will of Poland. We share that intent, actually. And I suppose that the very issue, as already mentioned, was not actually coined within NATO. Neither Poles nor the allies came to this idea that NATO is reinforced or at the eastern flank, but as already mentioned, it is the opportunities, it is the circumstances that caused, and including the annexation of the Crimea and the Donbas war, these are the factors that triggered such an evolution of the system, which was initiated at the Wales summit, which has eventually led to a conclusion or actually a number of conclusions that had led to those conclusions that were undertaken, that were drawn at the Summit of Ministers of Defense, and right now the Warsaw Summit of NATO will hopefully confirm them all, and probably will arrive at some concrete decisions. Obviously, I personally would like to join the general opinion indicating that meanwhile, the entire circumstance, not only in the east but also in the south, the situation of security has changed. And from the Polish perspective, a kind of a union, a kind of a alliance that will make decisions in Warsaw will make breakthrough decisions in Warsaw. Most definitely, everything suggests that these will be historical decisions that will be undertaken in Warsaw. But it does not mean that NATO, and I personally believe that, will not simply return to the past missions that were based on conclusions from the Cold War. Because besides typical traditional threats, there are still imminent, there are still the menace towards us. Let me just remind you the threat of potential, hopefully distant, potential of using nuclear weapons. Obviously, there are some new threats incoming. Not only am I speaking that from the perspective of the southern threat, we are using those notions such as hybrid threats, whatever that actually means, because it is differently being interpreted, is used differently with regard to the threat from the south and differently with regard to the threat incoming from the east. There are some new threats incoming, some new of them has occurred, those pertaining to the civilizational development and the matters of defense. There are some new developments, new phenomena also being emerging, which cause that what must be considered as a key target, especially for Poland as a country which is the host of the summit, is to maintain against those threats that need a redefinition of the policy, not only within NATO, but more broadly within this community of democratic countries, as we are dealing here with this huge challenge and a certain internal crisis within the European Union. So the supreme priority goal would be most definitely the unity and sustaining unity and uniformity. And again, let me repeat, 360 degrees, 28 for 28. These are the catchphrases that are being repeated quite frequently, but they should be actually repeated quite frequently. They should be used as often as possible, because from the perspective of Poland, I'm just thinking about this initiative of creating a group of 9 eastern flank countries originated at a meeting of group with the originator being also President Andrzej Duda. In documents, in minutes of this meeting, they stressed the matter of sustaining this optics for the entire alliance. That's the ground zero for all further actions to be undertaken. Obviously, yet another challenge to be tackled, actually that is worth being tackled and should be expanded, is the matter of partnership and very close collaboration in this region, in the closest region, with the key partners being Sweden and Finland. But also, what we see as urgent need is the need for collaboration with southern countries, those that are the stabilizing countries for this region. I'm talking about countries such as Jordan, such as the Gulf countries. Obviously, collaboration with those countries is very significant as well. And there is a full and utter consent that the Warsaw Summit should reinforce the intent to actually implement the accords from the Wales Summit as far as the increase of spending on defense is concerned. And obviously, the contribution of European states should be higher than it used to be before. Poland is trying to do their best to increase the spending on defense, and in this respect, as far as our country is concerned, we have this very good climate in the political seen because there's the full consent of all political elites, but also strong support from the society, which is this additional boost to our activities. And we are expecting the effects of the summit to also be an increase in the efforts undertaken in this respect. Obviously, when talking about the intensified military presence or the presence of NATO infrastructure, as sometimes it is more broadly put in Poland, in Baltic states, and generally speaking all along the eastern border of NATO. Now, in this respect, the matter to be elaborated upon is the relationship with Russia. And the last meeting, the last summit of ministers of defense of NATO countries had led to developing this document as an assessment of Russian policy. We, meaning Poland, we advocate a dialogue, a pragmatic dialogue, which is being conducted in parallel, at least focusing on becoming more proximate and eliminating the escalation of problems which may trigger some unexpected issues. And I'm truly hoping that this will be just the baseline for the summit discussion, which may eventually lead to improvement of the relationships I'm talking about. I may start there. That will be probably it as far as my command is concerned.
Thank you very much. In the Q&A, I'm sure we'll come back to you on some of these issues, defense spending, and probably also missile defense, Russia, et cetera. Rose, you've been looking at deterrence issues. You're one of America's leading expert on this set of issues. During the Cold War, it looks relatively simple compared to what we're looking at today. How do you look at this today, and particularly looking at it from a NATO prism and a nuclear prism?
Thank you very much, Fred, and thank you also for the opportunity to be here at this very timely meeting. I thought I would pick up on a point that Sandy made, which I welcome very much. He said that one of the primary goals coming out of the summit will be to convey an enhanced strengthened defense and deterrence stance for the alliance, and then went on to characterize that as enhanced forward presence, conventional capability, air, sea, ground capability throughout the territories of NATO and in the surrounding sea and air spaces. I think those are very valuable messages and contribute to the point that I wanted to make about deterrence. Today, when we talk about deterrence, in my community, too often we get fixated on nuclear capabilities, and we tend to focus on extended deterrence as being all about the nuclear weapons. But in fact, for many years, extended deterrence has been about the core defense capabilities of this alliance, whether conventional, whether missile defense, whether air defenses, whether nuclear capabilities. So all of the core defense capabilities of the alliance contribute to deterrence of the threat from Russia, from other threats facing the alliance. And this is a point we make exactly with our allies in Asia as well, that extended deterrence is all about the considerable capabilities, in that case of the United States of America, working with our Asian allies to provide for their deterrence and defense. So that message is a very welcome one, and I think it is one that we need to propagate. When we look at the particular nuclear threats emanating from Russia today, I think that we have to discern between the expected and the unexpected. When we negotiated the New START treaty back in 2009, we expected the Russians to be undertaking a modernization of their strategic nuclear forces because they were facing mass obsolescence, particularly of the ICBM forces, the intercontinental ballistic missiles that they had deployed in the 1970s and the 1980s. That was expected. We see it happening today. We see them replacing their ICBMs, but it is being done, and I want to stress this, under the particular structure of the New START Treaty, where they will be constrained to the central limits of the New START Treaty. That is 700 deployed delivery vehicles, whether sea-based or land-based ballistic missiles, bomber weapons, and 1,550 deployed operational warheads. So there's a predictability about their modernization of their strategic forces, partially because we've seen those plans coming down the road for many years now, but also because of the disarmament superstructure that we have built around their modernization in the strategic realm with the New START Treaty. And I'm glad to tell you that's one case where we are working very pragmatically with the Russians, and they are in good faith working to implement the New START Treaty. So far that has been a success, and it has kept, I think, that word predictability is enormously important. It's kept a bilateral predictability between us with regard to strategic nuclear weapons that is very valuable. What is unpredictable, unexpected, destabilizing, and dangerous is the nuclear saber-rattling that's been emanating from Moscow, accompanied by particular threats to forward deploy non-strategic nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad and possibly, and very dangerously, even in Crimea. And here we are very, very concerned about systems such as the Iskander, because they are deployed in both conventionally armed and nuclear-armed variants. Very difficult to discern which is which, contributing to destabilizing tendencies with regard to command and control, with regard to warning. And so here is a case where, you know, we are very concerned by what is going on with the Russians. We are very concerned by trends in Russian nuclear modernization. So perhaps I'll leave it at that.
I think that was a very important statement, so let me drill down a little bit on this question of predictable versus unpredictable. We didn't predict Crimea. We didn't predict what eventually the Russians did in Syria. At least most of us certainly didn't. In the month of April, there were multiple instances of Russian provocations on U.S. military installations. You mentioned some of this. A close encounter of a Russian jet on a U.S. destroyer. So the activity that you're talking about, these provocations, first of all, how should the U.S. and NATO respond to what you've talked about? And second of all, what does it say, and what can we take from this in terms of understanding military intent on behalf of Russia?
I think that part of it is an expression of military intent, but in the overarching environment where they are, the Kremlin is currently seeking to project this kind of tough guy image to the world, and yes, stand in a way that is, in their view, I think, strong, but to the rest of the world looks extremely threatening, and their behaviors are extremely threatening. We have been concerned about the incidents at sea, the incidents in the air, because they represent dangerous operational practice, and I'm sure that the General will have more to say about that. I think we have responded properly so far by very professional behavior by our naval forces, our captains at sea, our pilots, the aircraft operators, very professional, highly trained, very careful behavior when they encounter these incidents. So that professionalism and military responsible behavior, I think, is very, very important. But also, I think we are also right to seek ways to move away from this kind of threatening behavior by using the tools that we have available. In another week's time, there will be a meeting of the Incidents at Sea agreement in Moscow. Now, this agreement was, for many years, a sleepy little agreement. It was negotiated in the early 1970s precisely because at that period, we were butting heads with the Soviets quite a bit sea incidents in the air as well, not only in the European continent, but also in Asia. So it was negotiated in the early 1970s, particularly for that reason. It contributed very pragmatically to pulling the armed forces of our two countries apart, and our allies as well benefited from it. But it became a kind of routinized agreement that, as I call it, really proceeded under the radar scope for many, many years to operate without a lot of attention to it. That's why I called it a sleepy little agreement for many, many years. It's not a sleepy situation anymore. And the Incidents at Sea Agreement, I think, really must resume its early sharp focus and intensity in terms of helping us to deal with these current ongoing incidents. And so I do hope that the meeting that will be going on in Moscow next week will not be treated in a routine manner, but will be treated as a real problem-solving venue to try to take some of the danger out of the current situation. And I know the General will want to say more about this, but I really see the behavior we've been encountering from Russian aircraft and in some cases naval vessels to be irresponsible.
Thank you for those clear words. Senator, I'll ask your forbearance for another moment. I think I want to go to General Mingus after Rosa's comment, and then you can be our cleanup hitter and respond to whatever you've heard. And I've got a question to line up for you as well. But General Mingus, she used the term irresponsible. Is that what you're seeing? Is that what we're experiencing? And tell it from your point of view, from the military point of view, and what do you do about it?
Well, thanks, Fred. And on behalf of General Hodges and United States Army Europe, we are very, very honored to be here and part of this forum. And for those that are not familiar, United States Army Europe kind of plants its flag in Wiesbaden, Germany, and it provides the U.S. land forces for all of Europe in a joint, combined, and allied environment. But to get to your specific question, I guess I would just start similar to Sandy in that we, for the past 2 years, have been doing a lot. There was an immediate response in the spring of 2014 where we took elements from our 173rd Airborne Brigade down in Vicenza, Italy, and immediately pushed them up into the Baltic and Poland region. And they have been there, not that particular unit, but we've had a presence there ever since. Also, very quickly, we established the framework of Atlantic Resolve. And inside that Atlantic Resolve framework, we established what we call AR North, AR Central, and AR South. AR North consists of the 3 Baltic countries, AR Center consists of Hungary and Slovakia, and AR South consists of Romania and Bulgaria. And in that past year and a half, 2 years now, we've had a persistent, what we call a persistent presence in Atlantic Resolve North. And we've had an episodic presence in Atlantic Resolve South and Central. Why do we do this? It's to assure our allies, as NATO has kind of pointed out, and to deter our adversaries. General Hodges has a famous saying, and we've kind of all taken a liking to it, and that is, how do we make 30,000 look like 30,000, and kind of getting after some of the other specific points of your question. When he was here as a captain and I was here as a lieutenant in the 1980s, our mission was to assure our allies and deter our adversaries and to look out for our national interests. But there were 300,000 U.S. airmen, soldiers and Marines here in Europe. As we sit here today, our mission is to assure our allies, deter adversaries, and look out for our vital national interests, and we have 30,000 assigned to U.S. Army Europe. So he had to come up with a framework, and we have all embraced and embodied this over the last couple of years of how do we make 30,000 look like 300,000. And the first one is to empower our junior leaders. Given the distributed nature in which we operate from Estonia down to Bulgaria, without the empowerment of those junior leaders, none of this really works. The second is our regionally aligned forces, our rotational forces. As an example, our 1st Brigade of 3rd Infantry Division out of Fort Stewart, Georgia, is here on its 3rd rotation here in Europe. They're here for a 6-month rotation. They'll go home in September, and they are a critical part of making the force look bigger and be more effective than the numbers. The next is our partners and allies. There's nothing that we can't do. There are certain capacities that our partners and allies have that we do not have. We routinely use the German bridging assets to conduct operations, in which just yesterday, as part of a saber strike exercise that I think many in this room are familiar with, we did a river crossing in northeast Germany with a combination of German assets and U.S. The 4th component of that is our National Guard and Reserve. They are just a very, very important part of this overall framework. They routinely rotate through here. There's a very, very strong state sponsorship program where our states back home are aligned with countries here in Europe, and that has actually been ongoing for much longer than Atlantic Resolve. And the final is Dynamic Presence, which is our exercise program, our presence program, and it just so happens as we sit here today, we have in excess of 4,000 soldiers that are moving from Germany up into Poland to participate in Anaconda 16, which is a Polish-led multinational exercise that will involve over 20 nations, in total about 30,000 troops and soldiers from all those nations and about 13,000 U.S. soldiers. And that exercise will continue throughout the rest of this month. All those exercises, that's just a snippet, but there's been 85 just in the last year that we would count as major exercises. Over 100,000 soldiers from various nations, and we will continue to do that next year. In terms of any follow-on if there's during the Q&A, I know there's a lot of interest in terms of where are we going for the next year. There has been a decision made within our military leadership and within our government, starting in January of this coming year, instead of having the rotational forces come and go, we will have a heavy brigade combat team that will start to deploy in January of 2017, and there will be no more gaps on the back end. It'll be a 9-month rotation, and it will be immediately backfilled by another heavy brigade combat team. The majority of that force, or a large preponderance of that force, will be here in Poland. But it will also, as I talked about, that persistent and episodic presence will give us the ability to have a persistent presence from Estonia all the way down to Bulgaria. I can answer some follow-up questions on the enhanced forward presence that was alluded to earlier, but our President and our Secretary of Defense have indicated that we will be a leading nation if this, and we all believe it will come to fruition. And the last thing I would close with that General Hodges is really pushing, this is a lot of U.S. things that I talked about, but we can't do any of this unless it's truly a NATO-like effort. And so how do we as U.S. Army Europe become more NATO-like? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to the questions. Senator, NATO's engaging its biggest modernization effort since the Cold War. February, Pentagon announced it was quadrupling the budget for its European Reassurance Initiative, $3.4 billion for the 2017 fiscal year. So on the one hand, you can see some forward lean and more support out here. On the other hand, the domestic politics is uncertain in the U.S. ahead of the NATO summit, and you have a presidential candidate for the first time asking, in a campaign, asking some relatively serious questions about NATO and allies carrying their burden. Pavel touched on that as well as Poland steps up. Could you give us a little bit of feeling of how all this looks from the standpoint of Congress? Both with this rising threat, the NATO summit, but also domestic questions.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me just say it's an honor to be on the panel, and thank you for asking me and being here with us, with all these experts, if you will. I can tell you there's no talk at all in Congress that I've been a part of, and I'm on Armed Services, Veterans Committee, Energy Committee, Commerce Committee. No talk at all about the U.S. exiting NATO. Even though you might have been following a little bit of presidential politics, there's been some rhetoric there. There's nothing serious with inside the halls of Congress. So with that being said, there is other discussions that are very serious taking place. And one is the participation and basically the security concerns that we have. We believe, first of all, the United States, with its newfound energy that we have in gas and oil, that we can play a big part in the security of NATO, helping NATO more, if you will, be more secure and less dependent on Russia. We believe that if you've seen the vote that we've taken on exporting of oil, LNG, that's all a very positive step, and that's going to happen. There's support for that. And also that we have a trigger mechanism, if you will, protection, that the American public will not take a hit if the prices spike, that we have adjustments there that protects the American economy. So we think that there's a balance there to be had. We are very much concerned about only 5 out of the 28 that are paying their fair share, their dues. We're also concerned that NATO has no recourse and there's no punishment if they don't. So why should any of the other 23 countries take it serious that they've got to step to the plate? And if they think, don't worry, the Americans will always pay the price, I think that day is coming to an end. And I can tell you, it's every week we have discussions about this. So, the NATO countries should take this very seriously. We're concerned also about the security of what happened in France, the security information, the sharing of intelligence, flowing freely to basically make this more of a secured world, a secured Europe, a secured America. Those concerns are very valid. So I think that you're going to see the United States being the major player in NATO, wanting to hold the rest of the nations accountable and responsive and answer, and find out if, we have, 5 more countries that have asked for entrance into NATO. What would make us as United States believe that they will fulfill their obligation if we've made little attempt to make anybody fulfill their obligation? And if you don't think this is serious, just follow the presidential dialogue. This has been raised to a level where there's support among American public that America can't continue to be counted on as the peacekeepers of the world, as the police force of the world, as the basically piggy bank of the world. And it's time for all of us to really engage this partnership that we believe that was formed in 1948 and has grown, which we're very proud of. But our constituents are asking some tough questions and expect us to be held accountable and responsible. And even in our trading policies, when people are saying that the United States has been duped in every trade policy and it's not really a free trade because we have paid from the jobs and working families in America for these trade policies, that's the belief. And someone says if you tell a story long enough, someone might believe it. And in politics, we say, you better tell your story first before someone tells one on you. So we're dealing with that. The facts must be answered. Participation must be real. And there might be some consequences if you're not a member in good standing. And right now, NATO can't tell us what's the consequence for not being a member in good standing. And security being at the forefront, are you really serious? I mean, when you see what happened in Crimea, what's going on in Ukraine, the threat and all the games being played along the Baltics, and no one's really said, we're not really alarmed about that. We're really concerned and we're raising a lot of cane and wanting Washington to do something, but we're not going to do anything.
So Senator, let me take your question to Pavel, and then I hope we still have a few minutes for questions from the audience. I'm looking to our organizers to pass me a note. But this is a Democrat, to be clear, from West Virginia. And so what you're hearing is, if I'm not mistaken, Senator Manchin, is more of a bipartisan consensus coming from the mood of the American people that one is going to be more demanding of allies and more demanding of trade partners. Did I get that right? And then
I want
Pavel,
to make sure that the Armed Services Committee in the Senate is probably the most bipartisan, even though we're split with D's and R's. And basically, with the Republicans being in the majority, they're going to have a member or two more than we're going to have from the voting privileges. But that's one committee, I will tell you. I mean, we've consistently, for 50-some years, always passed a national defense authorization to make sure our military is funded and able to continue to run and defend the country and the world. We're looking at things in a bipartisan. We're not playing the politics with it, but I can tell you, Democrat and Republican senators alike are concerned about the issues I've just raised. They're concerned that we don't hold anybody's feet to the fire and that we are asked to continue to give. And that's something that's talked about continuously and never has been. I've been there 6 years. The last 4 years, it's consistently talked about. So I would say it's becoming real, and it elevated itself to the political platform of a presidential race.
Yeah, and Pavel, we will run this panel to 3 o'clock, so people will go quickly to the next breakout sessions straight from here. But because we want to get your questions, and I can see people want to ask some questions. It's a large panel, so it's taken some time to really tease out some very interesting first comments. Pavel, just very quickly, you were proud of where Poland has come. Why is it, given the dangers of the moment, both from the south and the east, that there's no larger support for greater defense spending in Europe than there is? And is that a problem? How big is this 2% problem? Some people in Europe tell me that that's overdone. There are other issues we should be measuring instead. And would you support the idea of some sort of sanctions against those that are under that level?
Well, for the time being, it's hard to imagine a mechanism of enforcing such sanctions. Well, it seems that currently what remains is to call for certain actions. But in a sense, the senator here expressed the following thought, namely that the only country which has some effective potential for exerting pressure is the United States, basically. The United States, which really can guarantee or is the biggest guarantor for this, and we wouldn't like the situation to happen in which the discussion would reach the point when we would hear, I'm saying we Europeans or Europe as a whole, we would hear that either you spend more, either you increase your contribution, or we reduce our presence, our commitment. Well, I believe that one needs to reflect, obviously, on the mechanisms, also in Poland, in relation to certain plans or projects, for instance, the increase in the number of our forces in territorial defense. There is ongoing discussion which fix mechanisms of financing and what kind of increase in financing we should provide for the army. Well, but actually other countries which are more exposed to risk. I'm talking about countries which actually have the feeling that the risk is greater, so they invest more on the flank, the countries on the flank I'm talking about. But the threat that actually affects the border countries, but it actually influences all the countries on the European continent in relation to the threats from the south, which are totally different in their nature than the threats from the east, but they also require larger commitment and larger spending on defense. And at this point, I believe that it's most legitimate to say, yes, we need to look for some mechanisms which will force the individual entities to meet the obligations undertaken, the ones from Wales still. But as the situation develops, perhaps these obligations should be increased further. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me go to the audience. We're a little overweight on the panel of Americans not by design but by evolution. So I'd particularly encourage European comments and questions. Identify yourself and to whom you'd like to pose a question, please. I'll pick up 2 or 3 here. Can we have a microphone here?
Up here,
Right in
front row.
Yeah, front row.
Do we stand up or do we just
Yes,
sitting
please.
down?
Why not?
Okay. Jacek Rostowski, former finance minister and deputy prime minister of Poland. I wanted to address the question of financing. There are some simple institutional mechanisms that one can use. Poland has a law which requires 2% of the current year's forecasted GDP to be the minimum that will be spent on defense in the following year. And I myself was an enthusiast under the previous government from 2014, of course, not before, of gradually increasing that percentage by 0.1% of GDP every year for the next 10 years. I think obviously there'll be more of a burden and more of a responsibility for the countries that are closer to the eastern threat. I never quite understand why we talk about an eastern flank. We seem to be an alliance which only has flanks. I would rather sort of call things by their proper name and say that we have a central front and we know where that central front is. But to return to the question of how one can exert pressure, the EU has this sort of thing well worked out. It could be a requirement for every NATO member to introduce that kind of law, to introduce the 2% as a legal requirement internally. If Germany can write into its constitution that it can't have any deficits, budget deficits, it can also write into its constitution that by 2020 or 2018, I'd rather it were 2018, it'll be spending 2% of its GDP on defense and 1 percentage point more by 10 years later. And finally, of course, how much you actually spend on defense depends enormously on what your GDP is, on how fast your GDP is growing. In 2009, Polish defense expenditure was between 1/3 and 1/2 of the Spanish. Today it's higher, mainly not because we increased the percentage, but because we had rapid economic growth, and our defense budget went up by 40%. So we also need economic policy to be part of our overall strategic defense thinking and go much more for growth than we have done so far. And the people to convince on this are the Germans. Thank you very much.
Fred, if I could just say one thing and respond back. No way am I suggesting that the United States will withhold its participation or reduce its participation in NATO as part of the punishment. That is nothing. You're not going to lose us. We're in for the long haul. We believe, and NATO's been tremendous on both sides of the pond, if you will. What we're saying is there's no urgency. We don't see anybody moving, and Poland's been a wonderful, wonderful participant and part of NATO, and we appreciate that, and they have stepped forward. We're just saying that it's hard for us to continue to go home to our constituency base and explain and why we continue to have to increase our spending or find priorities for our military to defend not only the United States, but mostly the free world, if you will, and we're willing to do that. But we like to see a partnership, and we're not seeing it. So that's all I'm saying, Fred. But there's no quid pro quo. You don't do this, we don't do this. No.
So I see your question. I'm going to come to you next. A quick comment by Sandy. This question next.
Yeah, I think we have to keep in mind the picture is not totally bleak, Senator, if I can even defend the European allies, since I represent all 28. There have been some countries that have increased spending in real terms, about 16 of the 28 last year. So we've bottomed out. It's not good enough. We do have 5 or at 2%, a couple that are very close, and 5 countries that have a commitment over, as the former finance minister suggested, to build towards 2% step by step over the next few years. Legislating it is a good idea. It takes it out of partisan politics. Of course, we found with some countries they have 5-year defense programs which are compromises that can't be touched. So even after the aggression against Ukraine, we found a couple countries that said, well, we can't change our defense budget for 3 or 4 years. So sometimes legislative solutions can become a straitjacket. But this is only about spending. The contributions of allies in the last couple of years have been impressive. We have the Spearhead Force, the High Readiness Joint Task Force that can deploy within 2 to 3 days. The lead nations for that are all Europeans. 7 different European countries have agreed to be the lead nation in a rotating basis. And it's actually a 3-year commitment. You have to kind of build up in the preceding year. You have the lead in year 2, and then you kind of build down, but are available to reinforce in year 3. So that's a success story for European allies. And I think if you look at our operations in Afghanistan, our maritime operations, even countries whose defense budgets don't look particularly robust are still contributing forces.
But Sandy, wouldn't that reflect in the expenditure? If they're doing what you're saying, that's going to reflect in the amount of expenditures
Well,
they have.
they're clearly mortgaging the future. They're not investing enough in new equipment, and that's where you could deliver and be a good ally in the short term, but you may end up with a hollow military.
Well, we're
down the
looking
road.
also at the size
That's
of...
why we're not in any way complacent. We're bearing down, and I think a lot of transparency, more transparency, naming and shaming, is one way to also...
Well, naming and shaming has not worked. I mean, we've been publishing for a long time here, but let me ask you this.
We haven't published all the details.
Well, the numbers of people in the military. Are their military numbers going down or up? If they're going up, it's going to reflect in the price and in the cost.
Yeah. Yeah, Senator, the other thing, just not to get too much involved in this, let me grab this question and come back. Well, very brief, General.
Without getting into
Yes, please.
the geopolitics of this, there's a mill-to-mill tactical component to this too, and in a positive way, because I'm out there all the time with our troopers that train with our partners, and that's one of the questions. And when you look at the definition of a partnership, it's the perceived or real feeling that there's a mutual and equally beneficial for both sides. And as I ask our troopers and leaders out there, we are gaining as much from our allies and partners as they are gaining from us. And so from a pure mill-to-mill perspective, very, very positive.
Thank you for that. Please.
Forgive me for not standing up. I have a laptop on my lap. So my name is Salwa Amin, Compact Magazine, Berlin. So my questions are both to Mr. Secretary Gottemöller and Mr. Secretary Ferschbo. You were mentioning the threats coming from the east and from the south, the latter meaning IS or those forces who want a caliphate. So if you would label those two as, how would you differentiate which is the more urgent threat to be fight against, or which is the bigger threat, the bigger danger, if you had to choose between the two? Thank you.
That's actually a terrific question. That's for the two, for Ambassador Vershbow
And me.
and Rose. Okay.
I don't think you can.
Under Secretary Gottemöller.
We have urgent threats to deal with from the east, from the south, and also I don't want to leave aside NATO's very important role, which is changing in Afghanistan, but also the work that must be done to train in Iraq and so forth. So there are, and I was very interested to hear mention from our Polish colleague about development of possible other partnerships in the Middle East with Jordan, etc. So making it possible to even expand cooperation in many ways. So I don't think you can say 1, 2, 3 in the way you are suggesting, but maybe Sandy has a different point of view.
No, I basically agree with that. I think it depends on where you live. I think within the alliance there are countries that tend to be much more focused on Russian behavior, the Russian military buildup, and the potential threat of Russian aggression. There's others that are more close to the instability and chaos of the Middle East. What NATO needs to do is ensure that everybody's security concerns are addressed effectively. That's why we talk 360-degree approach. all for one, one for all, whatever you want to call it. We have to have a strategy that is delivering effective responses to the threats that all of our allies face. So certainly as Deputy Secretary General, I would never rank order one over the other, or I would be out of a job.
So, General Mingus, I don't see any other questions from the audience, so I'm just going to close with one for you, which grows out of that question, because you served many tours of duty, including Iraq and Afghanistan. And so are we going to see those types of operations continue? Is that what the military is also planning for? Or how do you balance when you're looking at the two threats that the questioner was asking about? How does one militarily balance those two and prepare for it?
Obviously, I agree. We can't rank order 1, 2, 3, 4. Our chairman calls it 4+1, Iran, Korea, North Korea, and with the other problems that we've talked here, plus the violent extremist organizations that are out there. And our military has to be prepared to deal with that entire range of threats. He also talks about many of these are trans-regional, they're multidimensional, and there are state and non-state components to those that are out there. And so how does our military, in conjunction with our allies and our partners, organize ourselves to deal with the threats of the future? I'd also agree that because we can't say one or two, we have to organize ourselves to be able to deal with both simultaneously. And it is a lot about where you sit. And having talked to the leaders of the nations from both the North and the South, it is very much where you sit. But what I would offer is empathy to both could be a little better than maybe what it is.
Thank you for that answer. Clearly, it does depend where you sit. The world looks a lot different from Kiev than it does from Paris or from Warsaw from Paris. And so that's the nature of the alliance.
If you're in Turkey, it looks bad in every direction.
Yeah, it can look bad in every direction. When we started, I was discussing this with our Polish partners here in Wroclaw. When we started the Wroclaw Global Forum 7 years ago, there were a couple of years where it was a really fascinating intellectual exercise, but we were struggling for what was going to be our subject for the next year. And I can't say that we embrace the world that we're in. We certainly don't want this world of uncertainty and challenges from the South, the triple threat to Europe, from the South, from the East, and internally. But it certainly has shown the relevance of the Wrocław Global Forum and bringing you all together to talk about these problems transatlantically. There may have seldom been more important moments for transatlantic cooperation. So I want to thank you all for attending, thank the speakers for their comments, and look forward to continuing this discussion over the months and years to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you.